Across the Park podcast is proud to be sponsored by Globe Gas and Heating. For the best kitchen and bathroom renovations, boiler servicing and repair, and central and underfloor heating in the Northwest, head over to globecentralheating.com and quote Across the Park for a free quote. Hello, welcome back to Across the Park podcast with myself, Ian Mills, here in the amazing Pod Cafe studios with a very, very special guest. One of our friends became our friends through the podcast. He was one of our early audio guests. That show still does numbers. Now, people listen back. A 2.5 hour podcast. We're not going to keep him as long today, but we are going to revisit some of those tales for our YouTube audience. It's a pleasure and honour to have our mate in, Alan Myers. Alan, thanks for coming back on. How are you?
Great to be back in. Yeah, I'm good, thanks. Yeah, I was just talking to you before, off camera, and it was, a podcast which I remember fondly. I enjoyed it, and it did sort of. It felt like about 20 minutes, and as you say, it was a couple of hours. But I really enjoyed it. So pleased to be back.
Thank you so much. We're going to revisit some stories of that, and I want to talk about what's next for you, because you've just put an announcement on your Twitter that big things are possibly changing for you professionally. We're going to touch upon that. First of all, you're an Evertonian.
Yeah.
How did that journey begin as a fan? What were your games? What were your players? What were your moments?
I mean, it goes right back actually to when I was around probably 8 years old, and I always people keep asking me to write a book, and I've already decided on the title, and it's going to be Thank You, Mrs. McKee. And there's a reason for that. Is because at the time I lived in Old Swan, and there was a lady across the road. I used to cut hedges and wash cars and things like that, as most kids did at that age in Liverpool. And anyway, so this Mrs. McKee was across the road, and I used to wash her car for her, and she happened to be, would you believe, the cleaner for Harry Catterick at Belfield. And now I come from a family, my dad and my 6 brothers were all Liverpool fans. And I was the only Evertonian. I wasn't at that point. But that's how I became the only Evertonian in the family. Okay. And so Mrs. McKee at the time, older fans will remember, when you played the reserve games, you played them at Goodison or Anfield if it was Liverpool when the first team was away, alternate weeks. And at the time, they always had 2 free season tickets as staff of Everton. And she said to me this day, she said, do you want to watch Everton? So I said, you just say yes to anything, don't you? And she gave me these 2 reserve team tickets. They weren't the first team, because I was too young anyway to go to the reserve games. So I went and tried to get somebody to go with me, but no one would go with me. So I ended up on my own. And I'll never forget it. I had the silk scarf. You remember the silk scarf?
Yeah,
with
the old
little
school
tassels on the end,
Yeah.
And I remember walking along Priory Road, and all the coaches were parked up because Liverpool were playing Middlesbrough at the time. And so it was sort of, before the game or whatever. And I'm walking along, and this guy came from behind the coach. And he was a Middlesbrough fan who'd been chucked out of Anfield because he was drunk. And he came over to him, and I'll never forget his words. He said, "Give us your scarf or I'll break your neck." Which is, as an 8 or 9 year old, you take that seriously, And so I had to hand over my Everton silk scarf, So luckily my dad replaced it for me. But that was my first sort of encounter with Everton, really. I remember the likes of Ronnie Goodless coming in as a 15-year-old, and 14, 15.
Great winger,
playing. And of course, in those days, a lot of the players who were injured or whatever, or coming back from fitness, would play in the reserves. And I remember watching Bob Latchford play in the reserves a couple of times. And so I mean, that was my introduction. And those sort of around, 72. So, when I started going to see the first team was more around sort of 74. I think my first game was against Birmingham. We drew 1-1 or 2-2, if I remember rightly, in around 74. But those are my heroes, the John Connollys and the Martin Dobsons and all these players, great teams. Not successful in the way of winning things, but that blue of Everton with the triangle, and you never ever lose that feeling, you know, of seeing those players.
I think that team there is often forgotten because it's sandwiched in between the Holy Trinity and the 69, 70, and people look back, correctly so, with blue rose tinted glasses at that, and then they look back at the 80s again, correctly so, with rose tinted blue glasses. But that 70s team towards the end was a really good side, wasn't it?
Yeah, I always think the 70s were a sort of you know, a rite of passage as an Evertonian, you know, because we were so near and so far. I've just noticed that I put a tweet out the other day. Someone put a video of the Aston Villa games, you know, in the Cup, the Cup at the time, which I went to every one. And I remember saying, coming back from Old Trafford, and I must have been, when was that, 76, 77, I think it was. And I remember, so I'm sort of 14, 15 at this point, you know. And I remember coming back from Old Trafford crying in the car. And because, you know, as a 15-year-old, you know, you sort of, you don't really do that, you know, but I did because it was so emotional, you know, the roller coaster of the 3 games. And that was Everton all over, you know. You remember the Andy King goal against Liverpool after 7 years or whatever of not winning. And just so many, you know, we had Bernie Wright and, you know, Bernie the Bolt and, you know, and the characters were just unbelievable. Duncan McKenzie's magic, you know, and, you know, Bob Latchford with his 30 goals. And we were sort of, when you look back at it and you think about the moments that you had in that period, but we won nothing, you know, and it was a very strange time to be an Evertonian. But as I say, it taught you an awful lot about what we do as fans in this club and why we, you know, and lately, of course, the new generation of fans have had to go through that from 95 onwards, you know, and that is part of the uniqueness about this club. You know, other clubs have a lot of success, or the other way, you know, they don't really have any, you know, sort of success, you know, but we're sort of stuck in the middle somewhere, you know, and it messes with your head big time.
Yeah, well, you're the generation of supporter there where they're going to games in the 70s. You never knew what was coming, but the 80s must have been something else.
Yeah, the 80s, I mean, sadly, I missed a bit of the 80s. You know, I did go to games, obviously, you know, but I was, by the time the sort of mid-80s had come along, I actually was at a job of a coach driver, a foreign coach driver.
Okay.
So you won't believe the jobs I've had, honestly. And I've had more jobs in the job centre, but at the time, I was travelling abroad. In fact, I was actually travelling through Belgium, driving a coach through Belgium on the night of the Rapid Vienna game, you know, and listening to the World Service radio, you know, so I couldn't go, obviously. But yeah, I mean, but I went to, you know, when they won the titles, you know, against Luton, I think there was a game, and then QPR, I think, was another game.
Home games at the end of the season.
Yeah, I was, you know, I remember being at them, and, you know, and the 80s were just, I mean, it was just incredible. I remember, you know, being in the house of the aforementioned Liverpool fans, you know, with my dad and my brothers, and the Man United game was coming up when we won 5-0 against Man United, and I always remember, and it's so powerfully still there in my head, knowing that day that this side was going to win things. You know, they were the special team. You know, and even my dad acknowledged it on the day. I'll never forget it when they went 5-0 up. And he said, you know, looks like you've got a team here, lad, you know, and like, you know, so, you know, those moments, I mean, that, you know, the 80s were brilliant. I mean, we were so lucky, you know, to be entertained by such a great team.
Yeah, I mean, people like me, I was born in 85, so I can sort of claim I was alive for certain parts of it, but I obviously didn't remember it. I was brought up on the VHSs. My dad used to put the Bayern Munich game in. How that VHS survived the amount of plays that I had. And my generation were brought up on,
of course,
not too sure on, there was a little bit of, it wasn't always like this, you know, and I find myself doing the same. My little lad's 8, well, he's nearly 8, and he's got the big Everton mishmash on his wall. He's pointing to all these trophies. It's like, when did Everton win them? And I'm going on YouTube and I'm showing them. And at nearly 80, he's watching Rapid Vienna game and things, and that's an era of our history that is just so special, even for me to look back on. It
really was. And you know, we sort of, we had a period of, was it something like 14 years, wasn't it, where we won nothing? Yeah. And we thought that was terrible, you know, we as fans thought, you know, that's outrageous, you know, and and it started to get the pressure on players, and it sort of nearly turned with Howard, before he became successful, and it was starting to get quite angry, and whereas I think through the 70s we had things which sort of kept us engaged, and but it was starting to sort of get quite serious. And when you look at 30 years now, and I don't think it's enough. Sympathy's not the word, but I don't think enough attention has been given to the younger generation. There are lads and women of 30 years of age who have not seen Everton win anything.
It's normal to them. How sad it is.
Yeah, and we sort of, from our generation, and the 80s generation, we don't get that a lot of the time. We don't quite understand that. And so it's a different mentality, and we haven't got that mentality. Even now, even though we've been through the 30 years with them, we still don't have that mentality. Whereas I think those, as I say, I did a piece for Sky on the leaving of Goodison, and we went and spent time with a family, of all generations of Evertonians, and you could, as I say, you could see it in this young, from sort of 28, 30 years of age down, that it's just embedded in them that we haven't.
It's a shame, isn't it?
And it's terrible. It has to change. It's got to change.
Yeah. Well, look, let's hope it does. And we are going to end the show on looking forward to what we hope is coming next for the Mighty Blues. So you go from driving lorries in Belgium, you then work yourself into media and eventually into Everton Football Club. What was that journey like?
It was great. I mean, it was unexpected. I'll be honest with you. I'd just got a job full time. I was part time at Radio Merseyside, and then they revamped the breakfast show. Yeah. So I was brought in as a sports presenter for the breakfast show specifically at Radio Merseyside, and one of my regular listeners was a guy called Cliff Finch, who was director at the time.
Yes.
And with Peter Johnson, and I got a call one day, and I'd just got the full-time job as such, and I got a call, would you like to come over to Park Foods and have a discussion? So I said, yeah, and I'd got a relationship already with Peter Johnson, because obviously through my work at Radio Merseyside, I would interview him, and of course, Joe Royal was great, for us in the media, So I went over and I didn't really have any expectation. And he said to me, "Would you like to work at Everton in the as part of our sort of as a media man, So because strangely enough, press officers weren't a thing at that point. There were people who did the job, but they weren't known as a press officer as such. You know what I mean? It wasn't that less a director of comms, would you believe, later on in life, But so they just had a couple of guys who would look after the media, basically. The club itself would run the sort of message. Anyway, so they then offered me. I did it part time for a few months, and then they called me over and asked me if I wanted to do it full time, and of course, and he said, I always remember Cliff Finch saying to me, I know that, it'll be difficult to leave Auntie Beeb, and, he said, but, and I'm thinking, it's going to take me 5 seconds to decide, what I mean? It's not going to be difficult at all, but I couldn't let them see that, because obviously, so of course I got the job full time, and I was Everton's first sort of official press officer as such, they had, as I say, people doing it. And it was me and I think Claire Tomlinson at Arsenal at the time. She was the Arsenal, and there was a guy Paul Mace at Leicester, and strangely enough, a guy who was with Huddersfield Town, who were in what is now the Championship. Yes. And that was sort of the four of us really. That was the Press Officers Association, So I got the job, and the club was, we tried to, the great thing about Peter Johnson and Cliff, they were very innovative at the time. Yeah. People miss that, because of what happened with Peter Johnson in the end. People miss how innovative they were when you look at the club shop that was built. They built the Park End stand. They had radio and TV Everton.
Radio Everton. Wow.
Yeah, there was only Manchester United in the whole of the leagues that were doing such a similar thing, So they were quite ahead of their time, in fairness to them. So of course I loved that, because I loved radio, and we had Club Call, and we had and we had a magazine, the Evertonian, and
paper edition was amazing.
and Yeah, we tried a magazine, an actual magazine, a glossy magazine, and all the middle fell out one. You know, they just weren't durable. You know what I mean? So I think it was Ken Rogers. Someone came up with the idea. Why don't we do like a newspaper version? You know, and I said, okay, they're great. You know, and the internet was starting then. It sounds mad to even say it, you know, but it was because I remember we'd signed. I don't know whether it was Andrei Kanchelskis or maybe even. Anyway, whoever it was, we'd signed.
This is mid-90s, isn't it? Yeah.
This was it would be around 96, 95, 96, just after I mean, I hate to say this, you know, but I actually joined just after our last trophy.
Okay.
So if you're looking for someone to blame, you know, I'm your man. But no, I got all this sort of press backdrop and, you know, media, you know, with all the sponsors on and all the rest of it, you know, and it was just all pretty new, you know. It was never done this way, and I got I introduced like a sort of and at the time there was a thing called the Media Mafia, the Mersey Mafia,
okay,
who were like the regular newspaper guys, the Daily Mirror, you know, the Daily Star, you know, all these newspapers, and of course, they had free reign at that point. You know, they could just walk in the training ground at any time and speak to players. It was just crazy. You know, that was the way it was. So, of course, I brought in a bit more control, you know, and how we did these things. And the Premier League obviously was different now, and things were changing. Football was changing. The internet was. So, of course, we put an exclusive on the internet before the press conference, like 10 minutes or so before, you know, which is what people do now. And there was an absolute uproar.
I bet there was.
And I was threatened. I won't say who it was because it's not fair, you know, but one of the media guys, one of the newspaper guys actually offered me out and in the car park in Bullen Road.
Wow.
He wanted to, because he said, you can't do it. I said, well, of course we can, you know, we're the club. Yeah, but that's not right. You know, we have the first, you know.
Wow.
So he said, you're ruining our work, you know, you're ruining our business. So I said, well, you know, I'm sorry, but that's the way it's going to be, you know. So I was not flavour of the month for a while, you know, trying to establish that.
No Christmas cards that year?
No, definitely not, no. But yeah, so it was very different, and it was a new way of working. And as I say, it's mad to say it, but the internet was new then. You know, so we had to do this website. I mean, I always remember some of the things we brought in. One of the funniest stories at Everton was we obviously had the online store then, which was all very new, and of course it couldn't cope, you know, with different things. It was, you know, there were teething problems with it, not just at Everton, with a number of clubs. And I always remember walking into Andrew Watson, who was the commercial manager at the time, his office when I first started, and he had this shirt hanging up. It was the white one. Do you remember the white one? You know, John Collins. No, sorry, tell a lie. No, it's before that. No, tell a lie. It wasn't a white one. Anyway, whatever shirt it was. So I'm looking at it in his room, and he's got it hanging up, and it's got number 9 and DITTO on the back. You know where the name is. So it used to bug me, you know. And one day I said to him, this shirt bugs me. I said, what's that about? So he said, you don't know about that? So I said, no. So he said, I've got a letter here. He said, off a thing from online, you know, our online store. So I said, oh yeah. And it was from a fan. And the first line was, are you taking the FP, you know? He said, and I thought, what's that about, you know? He said, I ordered a adult Duncan Ferguson shirt, Ferguson 9, and a junior ditto, right?
No.
Yeah, and so someone had put the name ditto and number 9, and sent it out to him, you know, on the online store. So it was hilarious, and like he said, but no one will own up to it. We can't find out who did it, you know. So I have it there as a regular reminder of that. We don't make mistakes like that, you know. But brilliant, you know, and so those things were happening at the time. You know, we were all very new. I was very new as a press officer. Yeah. You know, I was very new as someone who worked in football. Yeah. You know, but I always never forget, you know, on my first day, you know, Joe Royle called me into Belfield, and he called me up to the coach's office, and he had all the coaches there, Woody Donachie and a few others. And he said to me, you're one of us now. You know, he said, we'll look after you, you know, and it was great. You know, I couldn't believe where I was, you know. I was in dreamland, you know. So, but yeah, brilliant time for me. Yeah.
Was part of the job difficult when the likes of Joe get dismissed?
That was a terrible day. Yeah, I mean, you know, we knew that something was. We didn't know Joe was going at all, you know. And I always remember it because we had I got into a bit of trouble with Sky on at the time because we had with Rob Palmer, and we had the Umbro tournament,
the Umbro Cup,
the Umbro Cup, and we had a press conference. And we were trying in those days, you know, it was difficult to get cameras and things to come down to cover these sort of things. And we had Warren Barton, and we had Joe was supposed to be there. We had whoever the Newcastle manager was at the time, I can't remember. But anyway, so we had this lineup on the thing, and it was a big thing because I think it was Alan Shearer's first. He just signed.
I think
just signed.
I think the Channel 5 were just launching, and that was their
That's
launch.
right. That's right. Yeah, and he got injured actually, Alan Shearer in that tournament early on. But anyway, so I said to it was also transfer deadline day, which was the sort of end of March, the last Thursday in March at the time. So I sort of cheekily said to Rob Palmer, you know, you might want to get your cameras down to this, you know, because I just wanted him. I knew nothing about the manager going or anything like that, you know. And I was just trying to make out. Anyway, they bring the camera down. It's transfer deadline, so they want to have cameras where the transfers are. They don't want to go and see the Umbro Cup launch, you know.
Yeah.
So anyway, so when they come in, they thought Warren Barton had signed for Everton first, you know, which was not true. He was there just as a... And I remember Rob... you know, tearing a strip off me, you know, saying, you know, we've come down here, you've sort of sold us a googly here, you know, we've come down here on good faith, you know, and so I said, well, look, I said to you, you might want to stay here. I said, that's all I'm saying to you. I've never said anything. So anyway, I went back to my office and thought, you know, I learned a lesson there, you know, don't kid the media, you know. So, and then of course, Michael Dunford calls me into his office and he said, and Jamie Spear, who was a young goalkeeper at the time, he was in the office as well. And Michael Dunford comes out in a bit of a rush and he says, stand by that fax and don't move. It was a fax, obviously, in those days, you know. So I'm right, okay. He said, the fax is going to come through from the chairman in a minute. He said, so of course, Jamie Spears, what's going on? I said, mind your own business, you know. I said, he was coming to sign a new contract. So I said, and he was like, badgering me. I said, James, just mind your own business, you know. So, you know, players are like. And anyway, next minute, the fax comes through, you know, it's coming out in seconds, you know, like, you know. And I'm like, come on, you know. And I'm reading it. And of course, I read it and I see, you know, and it really upset me, you know, because like, he was great, Joe, for me. You know, he's the best manager I worked with. Yeah. I got on with every single one of them, but I loved Joe, you know, as manager. And and this sort of fax came through, and Jamie Spear looked over my shoulder. He went, "Oh, no way," you know. I said, "Yeah." I said, "You know," I said, "Don't you be saying anything." No, I won't, you know. So anyway, then I had to go out, and so I said, rung Rob Palmer back again. I said, you still got your camera? He said, yeah, why? What's up? I said, well, come. He said, I'm not coming out. I said, no. I said, send it out. He said, well, I've moved on. He said, but George Gavin's around. So I said, okay. So anyway, they brought the camera back, and I read out, you know, that Joe had left the club, and it was all, of course, over Torre Andrew Flo, you know, and not being able to get him. Yeah. They promised him and got, I think, can't remember the guy's name. He was centre half, wasn't he? Towards Effenberg or something like that. Yeah, something like that. Effenberg, I think. Yes. Yeah. Anyway, whoever he was. And so when George Gowan, he said, "Oh, Rob was telling me that you know you had some." I said, "Well, there you go, you see." And I made out that I actually knew all about this all along, and I did open up to Rob many years later when we became colleagues at Sky, you know, and said, "No, I didn't know what the hell was going on that day," you know. But that was really the first dramatic sort of piece of news. I mean, I still have the facts. Actually, in my box, I have a box of sort of memories in the home, you know. And I was going through it the other week and for something, and then I find this fax, you know. And it's on it where I've sort of scrubbed a word out which I didn't like to say, you know, because saying something is different than reading something, if you know what I mean, you know. So, I you know, so I mean, that was, as I say, and then of course, you know, there was a big change then, and we had to meet. With the chairman. I met with the chairman on the Saturday. It was around Easter. I think it was Easter Saturday, and he asked me to meet him at Belfield. And of course, that was when the great moment when I said to him, we got there about 8:30 on a sunny Saturday morning. We were playing on the Monday, I think, and I said, "What are we doing?" And he said, "We're picking a temporary manager." So I said, "Oh, okay." So I said, what are you thinking? He said, well, I'm thinking either Dave Watson or Neville Southall. So I said, oh, okay. He said, but I'm thinking Neville because less responsibility as a goalkeeper as such. You know what I mean? You don't have the back four to organise and stuff like that. So I said, okay. So just as he's saying that, I see in the distance this Mercedes car turn into Belfield, you know, and Neville was always, even though he came from the furthest away in Llandudno, he was always first at training, and he was always early. Must have got up at 4 o'clock in the morning, you know. And he swings round. He was always mad in the car park as well. You know, he swings round, pulls up right in front of the door. You know, he was only a credit card width away from being in the door. You know, and he gets out, and he said he walks through me and the chairman and says, "All right, Myers, you fat something," you know. And it just bantered it, you know, at the time. And he walked in, and the chairman looked at me and he said, "It's down to 1."
Wow.
You know, and that was Neville's chance to be Everton manager, you know, for a while. And
what could have been? And
he didn't know, and just because he called me a fat something, you know. But and he, you know, to be fair, it was fair, you know. But at the time, you know. But yeah, no, I mean, great moments. And of course, Dave Watson was then made temporary manager for the last 6 games.
I recall that. Yeah,
and you know, Willie Donachie, and we managed to stay up because we were struggling at the time. You know,
a lot of young players in that team, wasn't there?
Yeah.
We spoke to Bawley, Richard Dunn, Danny Casamati was just coming through. Right. Michael Branch.
Yeah.
Even lads that you don't really recall, like John Hills and stuff.
Yeah,
John O'Connor. John O'Connor.
Would have been Graham Allen. Yeah. Graham Allen. Yeah.
One player who was a big part of that team, I want to ask you about is. It's a real shame how it ended for Gary's Everton career, and obviously he's sadly no longer with us. But what was Gary's speed like?
I love Gary. I you know, and that's not me saying that, you know, because of what's happened. Yeah. You know, I genuinely did like him, and I always remember when he came back, he played for Newcastle against us, and it was really, he was getting booed.
I remember.
And I was on the side of the pitch, and I shook his hand as he come off, and he went, "Oh, don't get yourself into trouble. I'll shake my hand." And I said, "Gary, I'll always shake your hand." You know, because he was a good, honest pro. You know, he was great to have around the place. He was always helpful from my point of view, from my job. And he was a top man. I always remember I got this thing through, and they wanted him to take part of in a Calvin Klein underwear advert.
I bet he did.
Because, of course, Gary was a bit of a looker, you know, as you probably remember. So I said to him, you know, "What do you think?" And, you know, so he said, "Oh, you know, Mrs. wouldn't allow that, you know." So I said, "Well," he said, "let me take it home and I'll have a think, you know, I'll talk to my Mrs." I said, "Yeah, no problem." Anyway, come the next day in canteen in Belfield. He said, "No, can't do that. I just got married." He said, "It's not the right for me, you know." So I said, "Okay." I mean, he's only happened to go in a pair of Calvin Klein underpants. It wasn't, you know. Anyway, so I said, "No problem." Anyway, a couple of days later, and I said, "Yeah, it's a shame about that." I said, "You know," I said, 10 grand, you know. And 10 grand? I said, "Yeah." He said, "You didn't tell me that." I said, "Well, that's what it was." So he said, "Oh, is it still?" I said, "No, it's gone now," you know. So you know, it's, you know, it might have been different, but he was such a pro, you know, Gary. He wanted it right, you know. He was, you know, and that was the irony of the stick he was getting, you know. And again, it was, you know, in a way, the club trying to put, and clubs do, you know, they have to defend themselves, and they have to put themselves in the right way, and they have to, you know, you know, because there was a lot of feeling around the club at the time that things weren't being done as well as they should have been, you know, without having a go at anyone.
I remember it,
and so Gary was sort of, you know, Gary went off and you know, he did well after that. You know, he did well after, but I know it really hurt him. You know, because the irony was he was a proper Evertonian and he wanted the best. He wasn't happy to stay there.
Yeah,
I remember having a conversation with him over a cup of tea in the canteen, and he said to me, he said, "I can't be here every day. I'll, you know, when I see what goes on, you know, in the training, and you know,
because he was the captain, wasn't he?
He was, yeah, and he, you know, he was a great player, and and then of course, you know, with what happened and. I remember coming back from holiday, I'd been away, and I went to the supermarket on the Sunday morning and got the phone call, you know, that had happened, and
tragic.
Just couldn't believe it, you know. Still can't believe it to this day, you know.
But, you never hear a bad word said about Gary Speed,
no,
and that's very rare, isn't it? There's always someone who has a thing.
He never
with
upset
Gary.
anyone.
There was never.
No, he never upset anyone. I always remember when I was with Sky, and he was manager of Wales, and they'd just beaten, I think it was Italy. Away, they'd beaten Italy. It was a massive scalp for them, you know. And I rang him on the bus, and he told everybody to shut up and be quiet, so he could do an interview with me on the phone. You know, this guy is like in the pinnacle of his managerial career already, you know, at this, you know, I don't know whether he was actually manager at the time or whether he's still playing. I can't remember now. But anyway, he told I could hear all the others singing, and, you know, he told them all to be quiet while he did this. He said, I'm doing an interview for Alan Myers. And I can imagine everyone looking, going, who's Alan Myers? You know what I mean? You know, because it wasn't the Everton players. It was, And, but such a gentleman, you know, and there's very few, I'll say very few, that's not right. But there are only so many players I ever sort of got close to and I ever spoke to on a personal basis, because that wasn't my job, you know. I wasn't there to be a friend, you know. I was there to be the press officer. And, you know, probably Nick Barmby, David Weir, Kev Campbell, you know, and other than that, really, I didn't sort of get mixed with many players because they had a different life to me, you know. They couldn't live that life, you know. And but Gary was one of them, and Gary was so honest and so straight to you, you know. I always remember having a big row with him once when he told me that, you know, the hour training that they do on a, you know, because they did like a train for about an hour, you know, and he said the intensity of that is like someone normal doing a normal job for the week. And we had this big row. I said, don't be stupid, you know, like, you know, I said, you know, you do nothing, you know, and we had this big row about it. But you could have that conversation with him, you know. He wasn't he never held anything against you, you know. But yeah, lovely guy.
We greatly missed him when he left as a player.
Yeah, we did.
As a supporter, going from sort of 96, 97 into 97, 98, that for me is where it all started going.
Yeah.
We were fine in summer 96 when you brought in Gary Speed, and you had Andre, and you had Duncan, and Graham Stewart, Joe Parkinson.
Yeah.
And then you go from having, I don't want to name a lesser player, it's not fair, but having lesser players.
We were going for Europe with
of course.
With Joe, you know. I mean, I think it was only Aston Villa that pipped us maybe. Or we got beat at...
Last game of the season, we beat Aston Villa.
We beat Aston Villa, but Arsenal had won, I think.
That's right.
Yeah, and they went instead of us. So we were close, you know, and then it did start to go wrong, you know. I think things changed with Peter Johnson and, you know, the finances and, you know, and... you know, it started to look like it was a bit too much for him, you know.
What was it like for you when you seen that? Because you're inside, and again, you've just described there, we're going for Europe. Yeah. As you're in there as an Evertonian and sort of falling down around you a little bit, what was that like?
You had to, you know, in my job, even when I went back in 2013, you know, you have to distance yourself as an Evertonian.
Okay.
You cannot work as an Evertonian.
Okay.
You wouldn't be able to do the job if you did. You know, there are times when, you know, like I could never watch a match. You know, I could never sit and watch a match. You know, I'm all right. I can deal with defeat after the game. Yeah. But I can't deal with it while you can do something about it. Yes. You know, it sounds mad. You know, we're supposed to be enjoying ourselves watching football, and it just wrecks me. Yeah, yeah. You know, I physically, you know, shattered at the end of a game. You know, and you know, but at the time you saw that so you just felt that things were not quite the same, you know. There wasn't, and of course when Joe left, Joe was great at keeping everything together, you know, and even in the bad times, even when it was going difficult, you know, he would have this great mentality to make you feel, you know, make you feel good. Yes. You know, I always remember my first away game being on the coach, and I was sat at the back minding my own business because I didn't even feel I should be on the coach, you know, but I was. He wanted me with him, with the team, and it was away at Chelsea, and he called me down just as we got onto the King's Road. He said, "Where's Myers?" I said, "Oh, me, Gaffer." He said, "Come down here." He asked Willie Donaghy to sit across the way, you know. Yeah. And he sat me next to him. He said, "Watch this, you know. This is Everton, you know." And we went in, we drove in. I can feel the hair standing up on the back of my neck. And there was a guy always on a lamppost. Wherever we went, this guy was on a lamppost. And he was like, you know, and you know, I wanted to play for Joe that day. You know what I mean? You know, that's how. And so you can imagine what players must have felt like.
Yeah, what he done for them. Yeah.
Yeah, and so we lost that. I think at that time, and then there was a messy summer of trying to replace Joe. You know, because Dave Watson was never going to take it on. You know,
was Bobby Robson being linked at one point? Wasn't it?
Bobby Robson pretty much had the job. Peter Johnson was away on a yacht in Monaco or wherever it was with Bobby Robson trying to convince him to join. And then there was Andy Gray.
Yes.
And I was in the office. And again, Michael Dunford says to me, "Stay by our phone. If the chairman rings, tell him that Andy's said no."
Okay.
So now I spoke to Andy.
It's your job to do that now.
Yeah, I spoke to. Well, it's just that Michael Dunn had to go out and do something. There was something that pressing that needed doing. Because in those days, there was all kinds coming at us. People don't realise it. There's so much coming at you, and you never had like it is today. It was very different. You didn't have the staff for a start. I mean, only me and my assistant Mark Rowan at the time ran the whole thing. The Evertonian, the club call, the internet, the TV Everton, the radio Everton. We were doing it all, and the press. Now there's like a cast of thousands in every club, and so anyway, I mean, in fairness, there's a lot more to do now, but we had that situation going on. So of course, then the chairman rings, doesn't he, while I'm in there, and he says, "Hello, Michael." I said, "No, it's Alan Myers, chairman." So, "Well, what are you doing answering Michael's phone?" I said, "Well, he's had to nip out somewhere." I said, and he said to give you the message that Andy said no, So I didn't really know what was going on. Oh no, you're saying no. So I was like, yeah, that's the message. So anyway, he was clearly upset, that the fact that. Now I've spoken to Andy, and he, since then, and he always maintains that he was never really offered the job, which I don't know. I mean, he would know better than me, of course. But that was, I know that happened, and so it was a really sort of difficult summer, and of course then I think Howard was a sort of, an emergency, bring Howard back as an emergency as such, and I'll never forget the lime green shirt, and
Park End,
and of course Inchy came and can't think of his name. Viv Busby, great fella, Viv,
Yes.
And that you knew at that point, and we were signing players, whoever we could get, because he came in late, Howard, because of all what had happened with Robson.
That was the Ravanelli summer, wasn't it?
Well, the Ravanelli, I mean, that was just,
He was there. I
was there, yeah. It was the Dave Watson testimonial against Rangers, and Howard calls me up and says, "Right, come down. I want you to, So he says, "Ravanelli's coming." So I said, "Okay." I never felt hands as big as Ravanelli's. Honestly, I nearly lost myself in his hands. They were that big, they were massive. And he shook hands and they broke my wrist. And then Howard said to me, we had a lovely lady called Mary at the training ground who used to do all this, the cooking and all the rest of it. Great, she was a great character. You couldn't, she'd tell you, if you weren't right, and so to speak. And anyway, he said to me, "Al, ring Mary, tell her to get the good cups out." He said, and there's no word of a lie. He said, we're going to bring him down to see, So he calls me in, and Ravanelli's sitting there, and he says, Howard says, "Chief," he's the chief to me, like I was the chief media, and he called me media chief, So he says, "Oh yeah." So anyway, so we'll go down to Belfield, and there's Mary's going, "What you mean, the good cups?" I said, "Well, none with chips. If you want chips? I'm not doing cooking that." I said, no, chips in the cups, And that's what it was like. It was crazy, And anyway, as it turned out, I think Ravanelli had thought we were going to pay his all his tax and and everything, and it didn't. I think he wanted. We wanted to pay him less because Middlesbrough had been relegated, and I think he wanted us to pay him more, than he was on at Middlesbrough. Yeah. So it was never going to really happen, I don't think. Yeah. But he was there, and when he left, I remember sitting there in the stands with the Rangers testimonial and thinking, "Oh God, here we go again. It's another debacle. Yeah. And, but yeah, I mean, it was, it was a strange old time, and that season, that 97-98 season, was just. Madness after madness. It
was chaos. I remember, like I said before, without repeating myself, it felt like a big difference. It was the first time in my life that we'd got. Well, no, sorry, Wimbledon was the first time, and it was. I remember my dad saying, "This won't happen again now." No. We've got a chairman who spends and Big Joe's in.
That's right.
And here we are again at the end of the season, 1998 against Coventry.
Yeah.
You've said on this podcast. You can't work as an Evertonian. How difficult was that day to separate the emotion?
That was the worst day of my whole time with Everton. Any time I've been employed by Everton, or any time that was the most incredible. I say day. It was, because it was months before. It was all building and building and building, and the pressure was really on. And I remember the players Howard took the players to Pontefract races, and which didn't go down well with the fans, and it didn't go down well with a number of players, to be honest. A couple of players refused to go, and it was just it was not a good time, you know. And you could see what Howard was trying to do. He was trying to get, you know, the morale up and, you know, get everyone together. And it, you know, he'd done that before, but you were talking different players now, and you didn't have the Reedies and the, you know, the characters. I mean, there were some characters there, in fairness, you know, but wasn't quite the same. So that week of the Coventry game, because of course the games were all on the Sunday because it was the last game of the season, and we had a sort of press conference on the Friday. It was like the cup final press conferences. You know, whenever you do a cup final, if you're ever in a cup final, not that I know about this personally, you know, because I've never done it, but you know, I've been to, you know, these things when teams were in the cup final, and you'd have like a number of players, sometimes even all the players, attend, and also the manager, and I'll never forget, you know, because the interest in us, you know, the spotlight on us was huge, you know, because, you know, even when you look at the Bournemouth game and the Palace game, and in at that time, people might not realise this or even believe it, but Everton going down was a 10 times bigger story, you know, because of we haven't really performed over the last few years. Yeah. You know, the Bournemouth and the Crystal Palace, people sort of half expecting it, you know, at times. Whereas at that point, it shouldn't have been happening.
You're champions 10 years prior.
Exactly, you know, so it was a bigger story. So I remember we were stood up by the canteen in Belfield, and there's like a sort of corridor, you know, before you come down the stairs, and there's big windows, and we looked out. I was with Howard, and the car park was full of media. There must have been 40, 50 media there. You know, it was just incredible. And at that point, you know, it wasn't like, that wouldn't be a big thing now, but, you know, because there's so many different media coming. But at that point, it was a lot, you know. And he went to me, bloody hell, lad. He said, what's going on here? So I said, Howard, it's mad, you know. I said, well, I'll tell you what I'm going to do. So he said, go on. I said, I'm going to do one. Everyone used to get one-on-ones. Everyone had one-on-ones. That's what it was like then, you know. It seems hard to even believe that, you know. I said, we're going to do one bit with all the TVs, and they'll all bunch in together. I said, we'll do one with all the radios, and, you know, they can ask all different questions, but, you know, you'll only do one interview. I said, and we'll do one with the thingy, you know, all together with the newspapers. Good idea, lad. That's a good idea. So I said, okay. So I go down and I tell them this, and it was all new to them. And of course, got the Mersey Mafia on me again. You can't do that. I said, well, that's the way it is. That's the way it's going to be. I'm sorry, you know. Anyway, they're going mad at me. I remember Richard Tanner, you know, I think it was the Mirror at the time. He's going, that's terrible, Alan, you know. So I said, well, you know, and things were changing, you know. And anyway, Howard eventually comes down, and he comes out the door at Belfield, and they're all there. And of course, the newspaper lads are all over to him, you know. Howard, Alan Myers is telling us we can only do one interview, you know. And he looks at me, Howard, and he's such a clever guy, you know, Howard. And he sussed the situation out. So he went, what are you telling them that for, lad? Let them do the one-on-ones, you know. And I was like, you know, and I couldn't say anything because it was the manager, you know. But the genius of him was that he had, you know, sussed the situation out, and he knew he needed them on his side. Yeah. So all of a sudden, he was the hero. And they're all looking at me as if they want to just slap me, you know, and tell me to go away, you know. And Howard's like, they're all following Howard. Thanks, Howard, you know. And he did.
How smart is that?
Brilliant. It's just brilliant, you know. And that was, people underestimate Howard for the way he dealt with the media. He was absolutely brilliant with the media. He could manage. He had them on his wrapped around his little finger, you know, at many times, you know. But yeah, so that was a little lesson for me, you know, which would be repeated a few years later, you know, in another situation. But
when you wake up that Sunday morning and it's the day of the game, how are you?
I was really nervous because I was genuinely nervous, you know. I was genuinely, because of course it's not just about losing a football game with us; it's about losing our jobs and losing, you know, and it wasn't good, you know, what was going to happen, and on top of that, we had so-called death threats on the chairman, on Peter Johnson,
I recall,
which, you know, you hear these things in football. You know, it's a bit irresponsible to say it was never going to happen, but you know, because you have to take those things seriously. You know what I mean? You know, you have to. You know, and but it was aggression in there. You know, and we'd seen it earlier on in the season. I think, you know, at a game,
Tottenham.
Yeah, and you know, it wasn't good. So of course we had CID in the place as well, and I had to get patted down to go in and see the chairman. Would you believe? That's how bad it was.
In case it was you.
Yeah, I mean, I like Peter. You know what I mean? I'd never do that to him. But so I remember going in the office, and there was a little chairman's office in halfway in the main stand, halfway up I think it's by the Alex Young suite, and it's just like a little private door, and he used to just use it on a match day, if he needed to go and be quiet somewhere and talk to someone. So we go in there, and I had a thing called a Ewer, which was a big tape-to-tape machine in those days. It's like radio, I bought my own. It was like a reel-to-reel thing, Yeah. So and you transferred it then onto a cassette, to play. So I said to him, look, Chairman, I said, no matter what happens this afternoon, I said, we can't put you up to the media afterwards. It's just too dangerous. I said, fans might storm the place, or, I just want you out the way in the boardroom. So yeah, you're right. So I said, okay. I said, so what I'm proposing to do is we'll do 2 statements, which we'll record now. I said, and one for staying up and one for going down. Right, okay. So I said, and I'll just put out which one, which whatever happens. So I said, because you just you'll say the wrong thing after the game, the emotions will be high, I said, yeah, okay, I understand that, So we do, and I'll never forget, hearing the words, he said something like, I've actually got the tape in my garage.
Wow.
I've still got the tape. And he said, I'm devastated with the relegation of this great club, and I just hearing the words, it sort of made it worse, and you think, God, this is real, this has
got cold.
Yeah,
you just say that.
This could happen, and as we left, stopped the recording, and as we left the door, he said, you do know, don't you, Alan, what happens if you put the wrong thing out, So, we stay up. I said, oh, no, I'll lose my job. He said, no. You'll lose your boat, and I won't say what he said.
The implications.
But the implications. So, I said, fair enough. So you can imagine the pressure, at the time. Like, you just know this can't happen, and like, of course, Gareth Farrelly, God bless him, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Because we didn't even make it easier then, because of course we missed a penalty, and
Thomas Mirelets one slipped through his hands.
Thomas, after doing well for us, it just squirmed through his arm, didn't it, from Dion Dublin. And
do you recall that it started raining near the end? It went dark.
Yes, it did. It was horrendous. And of course we kept listening. I was down in the tunnel because, as I said to you before, I couldn't watch, but I'd hear a noise first, and I'd be able to run into the room to watch our goal and things like that, And then, of course, I'm listening to the Chelsea game as well with Bolton, and they, Vialli's gone 2-0 up and whatever it was, and I think it was Jody Morris, wasn't it, who scored for them as well. And like, it was just, honestly, that night, it was crazy because we'd stayed up and everyone, I remember, one of the most dramatic moments was I came down the tunnel, and Don Hutchison was asking me, he said, I need the gaffer. I said, I haven't seen him. He said, help me find him. So I said, okay. So we were looking around. He said, and at the back of what they call the manager's office at the time, was like a little kit room. It was for match day kit room. Jimmy Martin would keep spares there. And you could walk in it, it was only small. It was like it was almost like a corridor, and then I see the door was slightly open, so I opened it up, and there was Howard sitting on the floor in tears,
what he would have went through
with the emotion, And as soon as he saw me and Don, he but we know he was upset, And he goes, all right, lads, all right, So I said, oh yeah, Howard, and Don asked him what he wanted to ask him, and Don looked at me and said, did you see that? I said, I did, yeah, And Howard went back, and next thing I know, I was sat on Howard's knee with a sort of 7-inch cigar in my mouth, I've never smoked a cigar in my life, and people say, and I agree with, you don't celebrate, and we weren't celebrating. It was total and utter relief.
Yeah, of course.
It was the pressure of everything that had gone on. And I remember going in the players' lounge, and there's Waggy's dad singing like the old crooners, and it was just that whole release of. And then I went out, everyone went to the town, and I was home by 10 o'clock. I told the taxi driver, I was that drunk, I told the taxi driver I lived in Prescott when I actually lived in Hale Wood. It was one of those moments, and I don't think I saw anyone for 2 days after that. I was that ill, but but that was pressure like no other, you know.
That's been likened to, I mean, you're saying celebrating there. You're not celebrating, but I think the most poignant sort of comparison I can give, Dan, I've heard this from other people, is if you've ever been so close to the line financially and then the bills come in, and then you get your wages. Yeah. And it's just relief. It's just you have a drink with your wife or whatever. Right. It's not celebrating.
It. No, it's a strange feeling. And like I say, and the thing was as well is that you knew it wasn't over at that point. Even though we'd stayed up, you knew we had, you know, because Howard. I remember going in. It was quite funny actually because Belfield was being sort of redeveloped.
Okay,
they were cleaning it up, you know, because. You know, it was looking a bit tatty, and you know, and I remember the polystyrene. Do you remember those tiles? And they were falling off the roof, and you know. And anyway, so there was only me and a guy called Brian Greenelch, and Howard in there, and Howard was trying to do some player deals, and we didn't really know what was happening because we sort of knew at the back of our mind that Howard would probably go, you know. But Peter Johnson was, I think, stung by what had happened the summer before. You know, he was keeping his manager in place until, you know, he knew. So I went in and I said to Howard, I said, because there was no cooking or anything like that. There was no canteen or anything, you know, because no players were there. There was just the three of us and the workmen. And I said, Howard, I'm just nipping down to West Derby Village. I said, to the Sayers. I said, you know, do you want a pie or a sausage roll or anything, you know, for your dinner, you know? So he said, yeah, I'll have a sausage roll. So I said, Greeny, have it? I said, yeah. I said, I'll have a sausage roll. Which was okay. And then he said, then get us one of those girly magazines, will you? So I'm like, oh God, you know, it can't get any worse than this, you know. So I'm thinking, I can't have Howard Kendall asking me for a girly magazine, you know. So I go into the next office and see Greeny, who was a good friend of Howard's, you know. And I said, Greeny, I said, I don't know what's going on. The gaffer's just asked me. He went, oh. I said, I don't know what to do. I said, I can't go in a shop and, you know. So Greeny said, leave it with me. So you come in, you know. So we go back into the office and he said, all right, gaffer. He said, you've asked Alan to get a thing. He goes, yeah. I'm going in to see my daughter in hospital. He said, and I want to take one in for it. He meant hello, or, you know, like
top shelf stuff.
Yeah. And I'm like, oh, you know, it's a good job I asked Greeny, really, you know, because, but that was the madness at the time. You didn't know what was going to happen next, you know, and so your head's in a place where you expect the worst, you know, and he just wanted woman's own or something, you know what I mean, to take to his daughter, which could have been a very embarrassing day for him, you know,
and you,
and for me, yeah. But of course, then I went on holiday actually, and with my family, and Howard was let go while I was away, and we sort of knew it was going to happen, and you know, and I went to see him in his house when I come back from holiday, and you know, he knew what was going on, you know, and he knew that time was up, and it was sad though, you know, to see this great man, because I got to be very friendly with Howard in the end, you know. He was hard work when he first came in, because he was very much the team only, you know what I mean? Yes. And, you know, unlike Joe and Walter and Roberta, you know, who brought me into the you know, the sort of centre circle, if you like. Howard didn't do that initially, and I fully respected that, you know, because I always saw the bus as the coach as an extension of the dressing room, really, you know. And
it's his, yeah.
So, but that was a strange time, and then of course Walter came, you know, after that. But,
I do want to come back to Walter, but I'm going to skip way ahead and then come back if this is okay, because Everton beat Crystal Palace 3-2. In 2022, Frank Lampard's dancing on the lounges, and there's you in the main stand, and you're looking at, I imagine, which is a sea of blue on the pitch, which you would have looked at in 1998. Was that like a out of body moment to see that again?
Do you know what? Strangely enough, in '98, I didn't think we'd go down.
Okay,
there was just something that was telling me that would be okay. I think it was probably naivety, and also that I didn't want to believe it.
Okay.
You know, I have to say that Crystal Palace moment, I genuinely thought we were going that season. That was the only time I've ever felt. I didn't think we'd go against Wimbledon for some bizarre reason, but I just felt that Crystal Palace. I don't know. I just felt that we didn't have the winners, if you know what I mean.
That's fair,
you know, I just felt that there were players who, don't get me wrong, I think they all gave, you know, everything for the club. You know, it's very rare that you don't see players not giving everything to the club.
No, exactly what you
mean. It might not be good enough, but, you know. And wondered whether or not we, you know, and of course, you know, Delhi came on in the second half.
Yeah, turned the game.
And he turned the game, you know, and you didn't see that happening, you know. And I remember I was actually stood next to Tony Grant, and both of us were jumping up and down, and you know, and I was so relieved, you know, because I genuinely thought it was all over, you know, especially when we went 2-0 down, and you know, you just couldn't write it, could you? You know. So that one, and I wasn't really close. I was working away for the Bournemouth game, so I wasn't really sort of. I watched it on television, strangely enough, and again, I didn't think we were going to go down against Bournemouth. I thought we'd beat Bournemouth and we'd be okay, you know. But the Palace game, you know, because of course, you know, the Coventry game, it wasn't even in our hands. You know, we could have won 3-0 and still gone down that day. You know, I think we stayed up on goal difference, didn't we?
We did. It was goal difference. Yeah. I was just thinking about the Palace one, where maybe you'd have thought, I can't believe I'm seeing this.
No, well, I did have that feeling. I mean, of course, you do think, you know, when is this going to end? You know,
it was the same stands. They hadn't been changed. It was the same fans.
Everything about it.
You got back in time.
Yeah, it was. You know, the difference was, I was only a fan at that point, so it was a different experience.
Yes.
You know, of course, obviously, I didn't want it to happen, and I was nervous, but I wasn't so engrossed with everything that was going on, and I wasn't looking at the consequences, really. Yeah. You know, which you don't do as a fan, really. You look at how it'll affect you.
Yes.
But you don't think about the consequences within the club.
I get
you know?
that,
So, and again, I actually think the consequences would have been worse at the Crystal Palace if we'd have gone down against, you know,
100%.
We hadn't beat Crystal Palace, you know, than at Coventry. I think we'd have probably bounced straight back after the Coventry one, but with a new manager and whatever. But I feared for us over the last 2 relegation battles that if we went down, the bottom would fall out, you know. Because we weren't in a good place as a club at that point.
Absolutely,
you know.
Can I ask you about 2 legends that you would have worked with on a match day?
Sure.
Dave Hickson, Brian LeBone. What were they like on a match day? Because they were like, they were doing the Snods and Graham Stewart role.
They were, Brian, I never really sort of, you know, I knew Brian. Obviously, we got on really well, but you know, I would often meet Brian in the street, you know, during a game, because he was like me, couldn't watch the games, and we'd walk up and down empty Goodison Road, you know, and listen for the crowd noise, you know. So but he was always great, Brian. No matter what you tried to do, no matter what you wanted to do, Brian would help you, you know, and he would say, yeah, okay, well, let's do that, you know, and even if we might not think of, you know, might not be his way, he would always try and help. And Dave was just legendary, you know. He's just, you know, he was, you know, I my first day at Everton, full-time day, and I wanted something to lunch. I was, you know, I'd had eaten in the morning because I was so nervous about going in and everything. So of course it gets to about 1 o'clock and I'm hungry, you know. And there was a chippy across the road called Bing's Chippy. It was known as
legendary chippy.
So I nipped over out on my own, didn't tell anyone because I didn't want anyone to know I was getting chips, you know. So I go over there and I got 2 sausages and a portion of chips, you see. And at the top of the tunnel, there's a little, it used to be like just mascot used to get changed in there and stuff like that. It's now used for something else, media, I think, or something. So I go in there on my own thinking no one will know me in here, you know, so no one will see me in here. So I'm eating away at the chips. And Dave had done the tour, you know, he did the tours at the time.
He did,
you know? And anyway, the door opened and I saw him and I was still in awe of him at that point, you know. I said, oh, hello, Dave, you know, how are you? You know, I said, you know, nervous, you know. I said, do you want a chip? You know, so he said, oh, yeah, you know, because he loved his food, Dave, you know. And he took a load of chips and one of my sausages, you know. I remember thinking, you cheeky boy, you know, I didn't say one of my sausages, you know what I mean? You know. And of course, you know, Dave Hickson's more than welcome to have anything I was eating, you know, but yeah, so he was great, Dave. I mean, I loved him and I loved the fact that he didn't care what he did as long as he was working with Everton and, you know, Pat, his wife, and, you know, brilliant, you know, so yeah, there's a lovely photograph which I kept of Dave sitting in the stand watching either the reserves or the under-21s, and you just see him in his own thoughts, you know, and the mind boggles as to think what he's thinking at that point, you know. It's a great photograph, and Dave was great, yeah, but both of those proper legends of the club.
Just to get back to sort of the timeline a little bit, what was the night like when Everton did the unthinkable and they sold Duncan Ferguson.
Well, that was just, I mean, funny enough, I put a piece together for Sky, which is going to be coming out in August. On that, people may have seen we do a thing called Transfer 360 now, where we talk about an old.
Yeah, great shows.
Yeah, and they're really good. And so I put we're doing a piece on Duncan Ferguson, both arriving and leaving Everton. But that night was just the most incredible night. You know, again, and again it was, it was a massive learning curve. But I said to you before, when Howard had said to me about, I'd learned the lesson, when he said to the media, "What are you doing?" And so you learn lessons, and I learned a big lesson on that night as well, because I remember there was a lot of trouble. I mean, there was a bit of a takeover thing going on at the time, and because Bill Kenwright and his consortium were looking to take over. Peter Johnson was in trouble, and I think they knew that, and of course this was going to push it over the edge. And I knew that I think we all knew. I think Walter, the story at the time was Walter didn't know that he was getting sold. Mm-hmm. I think he did. I think he knew he was going. Well, I know he knew he was going. Yeah. He might not have known what was going on the night. Yes. Which is fair enough. Even though I tried to tell him at half time, we were playing Newcastle, as you know. I think we won 1-0, didn't we?
Michael Ball scored a penalty.
Ball was a penalty, yeah. So anyway, the press are going mad in the press room upstairs, and they're saying, Duncan's going, Duncan's signing for Newcastle. I said, let me check, So I go downstairs, I see Walter coming up the tunnel at half time. I said, Walter, they're all saying Duncan's signing for Newcastle. All right, Al, you're not spoken to me. So I said, okay, and he carried on. So I thought I shouldn't really be bothering him at half time. He's got his team talk, and but the pressure was so much because we had people outside the ground as well, So I go up the stairs and I see Michael Dunford again, the secretary. And I said, Michael, they're going mad upstairs. I said, they want to know about Duncan going to Newcastle. Rubbish, absolute rubbish, Mr. Myers. He used to call me Mr. Myers. So I said, okay, great. Well, I'm up the stairs, go in, announce to the whole press room. Must have been 50 people in there, It's rubbish. So they're all typing away, Anyway, I come back down the stairs, quite relieved. I was taking me time coming back down the stairs. And I remember I told you about the little chairman's office.
Yes,
which is, So I come down, I see that door was slightly ajar, So I'm thinking, that's not right, that shouldn't be open, on a match day, because we always kept it locked, because obviously fans were in and out, So I get the door, thought, just check, see what's happening inside here. And I looked around the door, and there's Ruud Gullit, Duncan, and his agent signing the contract. And I'm like, I couldn't feel myself, like I'd gone into like this sort of trance thing, like I thought, what's going on? And of course, where Michael Dunford, I remember going for a job a few years later at another club, and they said to me, if you had any situations about, and I told them that situation, and they said, well, what did you think on, what do you think of the club secretary telling you that? And the thing is, in those days, you didn't say anything until it was definite. And as far as Michael Dunford was concerned,
of course, yeah.
He could have helped me and said, just say nothing, but of course, that then would have fueled everything, and he had to get this deal done. He didn't want any other interruption. So I sort of understood where he was coming from. It was hard for me because I'd made a fool of myself, in front of all the press. And next minute, Duncan comes out and, we need to get the car. We need to get to a car. And he came out and all the fans were outside. And I think his dad was waiting for him in the Winslow. And he jumps in this car and Ruud Gullit goes back to his seat on the bench. It was just bizarre, Wow. And there was all kids jumping on the back of the car. Duncan was, don't go, Duncan, And
Sport stuck it bad, yeah.
And it was mad, And anyway, off he went. And the next morning, me and Walter were summoned to the Park Foods for an emergency board meeting. And after 5 minutes, Peter Johnson walked out and he said to me, come on, Alan, you're coming with me. So I said, okay. So I get in his Rolls Royce and we go up to his house in Oxton, and I'm sat there, and that was like to 9 o'clock. And then it was 10 o'clock, 11 o'clock, 12 o'clock, 1 o'clock, 2 o'clock. And I'm thinking, all right, what's going on, So anyway, he comes down, eventually shows himself, Peter Johnson. He said to me, what do you think? I said, what about the situation? He said, yeah. I said, it's bad, Chairman. This is as bad as bad as it gets, really. And he said, oh, well, I'll be in Jersey in an hour,
That was him gone, wasn't it?
And he got on a flight. He said, can't remember the guy's name, but his chauffeur said, I'll get him to take you back to Park Foods. Walter will take you back to Belfield. I said, okay. And he got another car to the airport, and he got on his flight to Jersey, and that was the last we saw of him.
Yeah.
And I always remember later that day, he rang me and said, I'm going to send you a fax. I want you to get this out as soon as possible. So I said, no problem. So I see it, and it's his version of what had happened, you see. And Walter had said to me, if the chairman tells you to put anything out, I need to see it first before it goes out. So I said, no problem. So I tried ringing Walter, wasn't answering the phone. So, oh, God, So I didn't know what to do. So I went and hid by the Legends bar. There's toilets there. And this is no word of a lie. And I went and hid in the toilets because I just didn't know what to do. The chairman's ringing up every 5 minutes going, why isn't it out? He wanted it out. So I've turned my phone off, and I remember sitting, and I put my feet up on the toilet seat. So, because they were coming in the toilet, he had the people looking for me, and he was looking under the door, and someone was saying, Alan, are you in here? And I was like sitting in the seat going on, and anyway, it's just madness, you just think, what's going on, Yeah. And eventually Archie Knox rings me, and he says, Myers, because they never give you a second, Archie and Walter. They got, obviously they were mad. And he says, what's going on? I said, he says, you put that out, and Walter, I'll smash you, And I'm saying, I said, Archie, come on. I said, anyway, 10 minutes later, Walter rang me and said, you can put it out, Al, So I put it out. The chairman was going mad, why didn't you? And I always remember the chairman ringing me the next day, and he said, you'll laugh. He said, I go down to, the Liverpool Echo was delivered to Jersey, on the Jersey ferry, you see. And the guy, he said, they bring it in a bundle because there's a lot of Scousers in Jersey, He said, and they always want the pink Echo sort of thing. He said, or the Echo, He said, and there was a bundle. He said, and I went down. He said, and I had a deerstalker hat on. He said, so you couldn't see who I was. He said, and you have to wait there, and they threw them off, and you could take one of the papers. At the time, they'd sell it on the dockside sort of thing. He said, and the guy. He said, there's a big picture of me on the front page, not the back page, on the front page. He said, because, I was selling the clothing. He said, and the guy went, see him? That such and such lives on this island. He said, and I just went, oh, I believe so. He said, and walked off, in his deerstalker hat, because he had a good sense of humour, Peter Johnson, to be fair to him. I quite liked him, I'll be honest with you. But yeah, so that was and then of course Bill's consortium took over on Christmas Eve. I always remember midnight. I got a phone call at midnight on Christmas Eve. Put that press release out. I had a fax in my house, and sent the fax out on Christmas Eve. Wow. Christmas Eve midnight. So into Christmas Day, Typical Bill, wanted to be dramatic.
I actually can recall that Christmas being told that the Tribute Holdings at the time, I think it was. Yeah. Look, I'm a genuine believer in through darkness comes light, and through bad times, through good. I apply it to myself, and I think it applies to football, and I want to apply it to Duncan. Without Duncan leaving, we as a football club would have met Kevin Campbell. What a man he was. You want to talk about Kevin?
Yeah, Kevin was just, what can I say about Kevin, that hasn't already been said? As the footballer, Kevin was, when he came in, I'll never forget him, I'll never forget him for many reasons, but for this in particular. And, we'd had trouble with racism down the years. I think Les Ferdinand actually said on Radio Everton once that it was the ground where he got most racist comments, which was a bit of a shock to us, on Radio Everton, and that was fine. And we did have a problem, and something I tried to address when I was there as press officer, in the 90s, and because we needed to address it. Everybody just sort of pushed it under the carpet, not because they wanted to, but because they didn't know what to say. And so I said, look, we've got a show, that, and Kevin was brilliant for that. Kevin really helped. We did a great campaign about no entry to Goodison, for racism or sexism or whatever it was, and we did a great thing with, Kevin put an Everton shirt on. Which colour do you see? And it was so powerful at the time, and Kevin was like, I always remember somebody described this about me once, which it just summed up Kevin Campbell for me, is that when he came in, as he walked through the building, the lights went on. It was like
a moment that.
It was just, like it would literally, the room would light up.
Yeah.
You could see, because the dressing room was really stale at the time. Everyone was down. We had a big fight on our hands.
Yes.
To stay up in those 5 or 6 games, whatever it was, maybe 9 games. Can't remember now. But anyway, Kevin came in, and the rest is history. We know what he did, and he was just a gent. And of course, a few years later, I sort of was leaving the club. And Kev had been fantastic for me. Everything I wanted, he would help me. And I said to him, he said, "Why are you leaving, mate?" I said, "I've got to," and I said, and I didn't want to go. And, we were playing Middlesbrough. And he said, "I'm going to score today, Big Al." He used to call me Big Al. He used to, every time he see me, he'd put his arm, Big Al.
I remember the celebration.
Yeah. And he said to me, he said, "I'm going to score today." He said, "Watch on Match of the Day." He said, "I'll do a Big Al celebration when I score." So I said, "Okay." I'll just, he would just, and he gave me his captain's armband, and which I've still got today. And anyway, I've left the club officially at this point, because my last day was that game, and I'm watching Match of the Day, and we score, and I hadn't seen it because I hadn't seen the game, and of course he scores. I think we won 3-0 on the day, and he does the Big Al, and I'm sitting in my house in floods of tears, like I'm already emotional, because I've left the job I didn't want to leave, and Kevin did that, and he was just such a incredible human being. He's someone who I've met very few people like Kevin, as far as, I speak to his mate, Red Nose John, he used to have banter on Twitter with, and he's a great guy, John Simmons. And, Kevin, John said something about Kevin, which is so right. And he said it to me as well, and it was only John that reminded me, is that when you sometimes you get frustrated with people, and, you'd say, and you'd moan to Kev about, that fella, he's getting on my nerves. And he'd say, Big Al, let's not worry about that, have positive thoughts, mate. Let's not. He might have a reason for being acting the way he does. And he would never have it. And that's such a talent for somebody, or such a not a talent, but a sort of a good feature of somebody. Is to have that, where the easy thing to do is to support your mate and go, yeah, you're right, and have that. Kevin just didn't want aggression, or didn't want that bitterness, or he felt your life was better without it, which is right, and that was right through to the end. I went to see him, and still to this day it upsets me, to see him like that. But what a great person, such a lovely man, and we, I still have his number on my phone, and I still sometimes
never delete it.
Yeah, I never delete it, and I'll sometimes, even though I don't mind saying, ring it just to hear his voice,
No.
and you ring up and you say, he'd go, Big Al, what's going on, man? And if I wanted to vent about anything, at Everton, they played rubbish or whatever, I'd ring him and go, and he'd say, Big Al, listen. We'll be all right, son. Next week we'll play them and we can do this, and you just make you feel better, and sadly missed it. And the best thing I heard over the time when he was ill and sadly passed away, is someone said he might have won trophies with Arsenal, but he won hearts at Everton.
So true.
And I thought that's that, and he did. I mean, I don't think there's an Everton fan that would ever have a bad word about Kevin.
No.
In fact, I don't know anyone would ever have a bad word with Kevin. And. But great fella, and sadly missed.
A lot of that just made the arms, the little miniature hairs over my arm stands up. We've had a lot of time from you today. I appreciate it. I've got 2 more questions if you don't mind. Then we'll just talk about what's next. Paul Gascoigne. Yeah. What was Paul Gascoigne like around Belfield, around the club?
Well, I always remember from the day I was sent down by Michael Dunford. He said to me, "I want you to go and meet Paul Gascoigne. He's turning up at the Bullen's Road entrance, He said, just go and meet him and bring him up for the press conference." So I said, God, really? That's the first I heard that he was coming, So I go downstairs and there's this Land Rover, sort of Range Rover, sorry. And there he is, just sitting drove himself from Middlesbrough, down to him, or Newcastle. And he opens the window, electric window. I said, all right, Paul, I'm being very professional, I said, my name's Alan Myers. I said, I'm the press officer here. I'm here to just help you and take you to where you need to go. He said, I go and get us 20 tabs. So I said, sorry? So he says, go and get us 20 tabs. I didn't know what the hell he was talking about. I didn't know what tabs were, So I said, 20 tabs. So he said, aye, cigarettes, man. Don't you know what tabs are? I said, no, I don't know. I said, is this the Paul Gascoigne wit that we've all heard of? I said, are you winding me up? Myers, go and get me 20 tabs. And that was the first time he ever calls me Myers, because that stuck. Even Sky now, people call me Myers because of Paul Gascoigne. And he was just, my job responsibilities went up 50%. He would turn up at my office before training with his 2 kids, and he'd say, just nipping down here, Myers, won't be a minute. And then 5 hours later, I'd have had his kids playing in my office for 5 hours, and looking after them, and we'd be here for another program, if I told you some of the things he got up to, he was just the most incredible, and he has his troubles, it's fair to say that, he's not always been a role model, and far from it, but he is a genuinely generous man, massive heart, sometimes that heart, sort of goes the wrong way, and that should be called out. It's not right to make him out to be, something. But I will always think special of Paul.
Was he a funny person to be around?
The funniest person I've ever met.
Just naturally,
genuinely the funniest person. I remember going down one day to Belfield, and he came out, and he was really smart. Which was not like him. He was a scruffy fella. Most of the time. When he cleaned himself up, he was good. But most of the time, he'd just be in his trackie, and you'd know what he'd had for dinner for the last 3 days. And he came out, and he was all corduroys on, nice suede jacket, and I thought, I said, where are you off to? He says, I've got a meeting, Myers, with me, my agent. So I said, all right, okay. So he gets in his car and he goes, and I go in, and there's all shouting in the dressing room, in the thing. Sue on reception was, and they had Alex and Yarko, he's gone with my clothes, right? And Paul had got dressed in Alex and Yarko's clothes, left his tracksuit on Alex's peg, and he was losing the plot. No wonder Nyarko couldn't make it at Everton, because he had him sitting next to him for all the time. And it was just hilarious. And I said to Sue, and it's funny how he gets you, I thought he looked smart, So she said, oh, Alan, she said, he's got me up the wall, So, he was just the most funniest person. Yeah. I mean, there's a great story. I don't know if we've got time, but there's a great story about when we went to do Question of Sport. Have we got time?
Yeah.
And this is the one which got me, and I'll keep it brief. But so basically, a mate of mine was the producer of Question of Sport, and he asked me to get Paul on. So I said to Walter, "Come to do it," and he says to me, "You can do it, Al, but it's down to you. Anything goes wrong, it's down to you." Long story short, I pick him up. Would never sit in the front of the car, Paul. He always sat in the back because he said the paparazzi would get him, I'm not so sure that was the case at that point, but, anyway, he'd come through that life. Yeah. So that day, I'd done a little bit of shopping for my wife, I had a few little bits and pieces of food, groceries. And I was also been to pick up a box of photographs. We used to get photographs so the players could sign them and give out PR things. So that's all in the back of the car. So I said, do me a favour, Paul. I'm going 70 miles an hour up on the M62 to Manchester to the BBC studios. So do me a favour, sign your pictures for me. So he says, all right, Myers, okay. And he's best wishes, Paul Gascoigne, best wishes, Paul Gascoigne. And then he gets Gary Naismith's best wishes, Paul Gascoigne. And then he gets David Weir's best wishes, Paul. I said, Paul, don't start. I said, I've just spent £300 on that. I said, so stop it, So, and I can't do anything about it. I'm on the motorway, And he's going, right, Myers, he's saying, I can't remember who the other player was. Thomas Myers. Oh, yeah, best wishes, Paul. I said, you're a dickhead. I said, and then he signs the back seat of my car, the headrest. And then he signs my handbrake, and I'm like, I'm losing the plot, So I get there, and I said, you're an idiot. I said, you've ruined the whole box. I'm proper, angry with him, So anyway, he wasn't supposed to drink. So, of course, then, I told him, that he wasn't supposed to have a drink. Anyway, long story short, they do 3 programs each time that they film. So I come back. I was watching one of the other programs being filmed. We had the likes of David Ginola on R1 and people like that. Strangely enough, who bit later on joined us, Anyway, so I came back and I couldn't find it. I said to the guy from Christian, where's Paul? Don't know. He was in a minute ago, So anyway, I find him in a cupboard with a bottle, of drink. And I said, Paul, you're out of order. I said, you've let me down. I said, quite well, you're not allowed to. Anyway, so I told him I'd had enough of him, and I let him go. I said, do what you want. I said, you're getting me into trouble, if you have a drink, because I knew what would happen.
Yeah, of course.
It wouldn't just be one, and he'd be struggling the next day in training and whatever, or to get to training. And anyway, I came home and I was really angry, my missus, I went to bed, my missus, what's up? I said, don't ask me. So anyway, I woke up the next morning, I was still as angry as I was, because I knew I was going into something, and I come downstairs and my wife's standing there, by the worktop thing, and I said, what's wrong? So she said, why is every slice of our bread signed best wishes, Paul Gascoigne? And I said, what? And we had a Warburton's loaf, the orange loaf.
A toaster.
He'd literally taken every slice out, signed best wishes Paul Gascoigne on every slice of toast. And that was what he was like. He was obsessive, you know what I mean? And you just couldn't hate him, you know what I mean? I just burst out laughing. And she said, why has he done that? I said, I don't know. I said, I can't explain it. I said, but, and I come in and I took one of the slices with me and I said to him, you idiot, and he was like, ha, 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 and it's funny, doesn't even get close, his mind was, I remember we played up at Newcastle, and we won 1-0. Kevin Campbell scored actually that day, and I was stood by the touchline, not the touchline, the dugout sort of thing, waiting, because I did the press there, for Walter. Anyway, we were struggling that day, but we won. And I remember he did, the ball came out to him and he did a little back flick, which got to Gary Naismith, and then he went up the wing, crossed it in, and Kev Campbell scored.
I remember, yeah.
And we won 1-0. Brilliant,
Yeah.
And he comes over to the touchline. This is like 40,000 in there, and he's shouting to me, Myers, did you see the flick? And I'm going, yeah, and he's going, did you see that? I said, yeah, I saw it, yeah. So he couldn't believe that Anyway, at the end of the game, Archie says to me, they used to park the coach outside the front of the steps at Newcastle, and Archie says to me, Myers, get the manager, get Walter, we need to get on, and get Gascoigne. So I said, okay, so I go up and I couldn't find Walter. I went to the Newcastle manager's office, he wasn't there. So I went to our dressing room and there's Walter just leaning on the wall. So I said, you all right? I said, Archie wants to go, So he said, I'm just waiting for him, So I said, who? So he says, him. So I go round the back, and in the shower, it's like a massage table, which they had to do the treatment on, or whatever, treatment table. And there's Paul crying his eyes out. I said, I'm thinking, what's going on here? I said, are you all right? And he said, I'm just so happy. He said, he said, I'll be all right in a minute, and he was just so emotional, because we'd won. Yeah. And that was what he was. And Walter had seen it all before, and he came out the shower thing, sort of thing, all dressed and everything, but he came out the shower room and Walter went, you all right? And he goes, yeah. He goes, okay. And we got on the coach and we went. And that was what football meant to him, and he's such an emotional man, it was, but yeah, so I said I'd keep it short, but it wasn't.
The Gascoigne stories, I could listen all day. Very quickly before we let you go, you've touched upon leaving in 2001.
Yes.
You returned in 2013. You were doing things differently. Social media was around, and you were very, very active on Twitter, which is now X. We had the badge scenario.
Yeah.
Roberto was fresh and new. What was that period like to be in?
It was great. It was a lovely, enjoyable 7 months, but it was also a very difficult 7 months for me, because I got myself to a position again where I think I'm going to have to leave here, because certain people aren't, I'm not going to go into it in these days now, but certain people at the club didn't particularly want me there, and other people, the chairman, Bill Kenwright, had wanted me. I was his choice to bring back, and it had been brilliant. Couldn't have asked for a better relationship with the fans, which still exists to today.
Yes, it does.
Which is, I'm so privileged to be able to, have that relationship with the fans. And simply because I talked to them, and I engage with them.
Communication.
Communication. And people say to me, what is the secret of good communication? And I said, there is no secret. It's just be honest. Just there will be times when you disagree. There will be times when fans will be angry with you, but and I have to say I was guilty of the opposite when I was first there, and tied up in the way football clubs think. They fear their fan bases a lot of the time, and
you certainly weren't that in 13. You engaged,
no.
and
Absolutely.
You at the tea parties.
I didn't care.
The votes.
I would go out. I remember going out to this guy who tried to get a first kit for his newborn grandson, and he couldn't get it. Didn't have it in stock, and he said, it's summer. It's the new stock. He said, and you've run out. So I went to his house, and he was a bit taken aback. And I sat there and I said, "You're right. We should have done better." And he couldn't believe. He said, "I can't believe that you've come out to tell me that." I said, "Well, I'm not going to go to every fan and do that because I can't do that." I said, "But the bottom line is, it's important that people see that I acknowledge when we get it wrong, and we got it wrong, And I said to the commercial manager at the time, "This is poor. We should do better, And we ended up having a cup of tea talking about, he loved Bob Latchford the same as me. And we just sat and, and next minute he was on social media saying, I can't believe what's just that, and that spreads a word that people are actually listening to you, you know, and as I say, there will be times at a football club where fans just won't, and I think it'll come soon, because, Everton's going to change in the next few years, I went through the whole Manchester City change as a reporter, and I watched everything, and the same thing is going to happen. I mean, I hope we get the same results,
too.
But like the change will come. We will become a very different club to the one at Goodison, that where everyone knows each other and everyone had their little, routine and the pies and it'll be a different, completely and utterly different football club going forward. But that's the price you have to pay if you want success in the modern game. So you either stay the way you were or you want to move on, and people have got to, Everton fans have got to understand that change is coming, and they've got to, I'm sure the club will, because there's still a lot of very good people at the club who understand the club ethos, and the way the fans think. But there's also people at the club who don't know that Everton, and they've got a job to do, and they've got to make it commercially viable, and that will look very different, I think, to what we've seen in recent years, or for a long time before.
Well, it's a huge job on and off.
Yeah,
I hope we're in safe hands. I think on the pitch, we're in safe hands. Yeah, but you've said on your social media recently, which I was gutted about. I honestly think you're the best they've got. But you're leaving Sky Sports. Yeah. Are you going to the golf course, or are you doing more things? I know maybe things in the pipeline, but are we going to see more of you, or are you off into the sunset now?
I've hit a golf ball once in my life, and I cut my thumb with me other nail. Okay. That's how bad I am at golf. So I won't be coming. I won't be going to any golf course. No, I want to carry on and do. I've got so many things I want to do. My time at Sky has come to an end. Naturally, it's the time to move on, and when you get to my age, television's, not the place to be as such, you move on, and I will be working for Sky, hopefully on a freelance basis. So I don't think you've seen the end of me. In fact, you might even see a little bit more of me, because the job I've had over the last few years has been very much behind the scenes, whereas I might be actually doing some more reporting. But I can't do that for a while because of the restrictions and stuff. So I'm hoping to do that. But I have other things which I want to do. I want to do more with Everton and try and do, with Everton fans. I've got a lot of things on my mind that I want to do that. I've been asked to write a book a couple of times, but I don't want to do that just yet. I don't even know whether I'll do it at all, to be honest, but because I think if you're going to write a book, you have to be brutally honest. And sometimes it's not good to be brutally honest, so I'll see about that. I don't know whether, apart from a certain group of Evertonians, I'm not so sure it would sell. To be honest,
I think it would.
Yeah, I think it would sell to a certain group, but no. I mean, I just want to do. I don't want to. I'm 63. I've I've got loads of time yet. You
Yes.
know, I don't want to retire. You know, and you know, because it's not good for you, I don't think. But yeah, so and I'll be able to go to a lot more games now as well, because of course you couldn't work in most Saturdays. You know, you couldn't go. You know, so might struggle to get a season ticket now, but you know, I'll certainly be there. You know.
Oh, that'd be good. And I'm pleased as a fan of yours and a friend of yours that you're going to carry on. I'm sure lots of people agree. We've kept you an awful long time. Thank you so much.
I just want to say though, you know what I'm saying. You know that these things, these podcasts are just so good. You know, and we're blessed with Everton. Actually, you know, we've got some really good fan groups who do good podcasts and things. You know, and this one's always been a sort of. I have a soft spot for this one, you know, because I loved initially when you did the sort of across the park and you wanted to blend the two. I thought that was a really good idea, and I thought it was, you know, I thought it was different, you know, and what I've always really enjoyed, and I'm not just trying to, you know, be nice just because I'm here, but you know, genuinely love the conversation on this podcast, you know, and it is conversational rather than news gathering, you know, sort of, and so it's such a vital part of, you know, and I you know, I'm glad to see the club embracing it at times, you know, and you know, that's important, I think, you know. Yeah.
Well, very kind words. I didn't expect the show to end with those, but we appreciate it. Like I said, I've been a fan of yours for a long time. So thank you for what you've done for Everton Football Club. I appreciate it. And Mr. Myers, thank you for coming back on Across the Park podcast.
Been a pleasure.
Thank you for watching, guys. There's still some tears in my eyes, some of the funny stories there. So I hope you enjoyed that as much as I did. We've had Mr. Alan Myers back in the Pod Cafe studio. Please share with all the Everton groups that you're in, and please subscribe as well. It really does help us at Across the Park podcast. More importantly, I hope you're having a great summer. The kids are off soon. It's going to be chaos. It's going to be chaos. And then the season starts again. Cannot wait. Thank you to Alan Myers for coming back on. And thank you to you for watching and listening. Up the Toffees.